It's a great pleasure to be with you. I'm Nick Burns, professor at the Harvard Kennedy School and former American Foreign Service officer, American diplomat. I wish I could be with you in South Korea, in Seoul, but the pandemic prevents that, and so I'm very happy to address you by video. I'm looking forward to a good conference, and I hope that my remarks will help to shed some light on what's happening here in the United States. The first thing I want to say to this very distinguished audience is that this is obviously a very unusual time in the United States. We've had our election. President-elect Joe Biden has won the election with his Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. There's no question about that. There's no question in my mind that President Biden and Vice President Harris will take office at noon on January 20th, just a few months from now in 2021. But we're going through an unusual transition where President Trump is contesting the election. I think his efforts will fail. As we go through this transition, of course, the United States is conscious, I think all Americans are, that we have responsibilities at home. We have also responsibilities overseas and around the world. And that's what I wanted to talk to you today. What can we expect that the United States will do as priority issues in the next year or two? I think the first thing to say is that it makes sense that the United States, the American people, are going to have to take care of what's happening inside the United States first. As you know, we're suffering through a terrible pandemic. I know that South Korea is as well, although your record is one of the very best records in the world in coping with the pandemic. Here in the United States, we have 250,000 people that have died from the pandemic. That number could increase to 400,000 by February, March, April of 2021. There's no question, I think, that the new Congress, both Republican and Democratic parties, and the new president and his administration will have to focus on the pandemic at home. It's a true crisis here. Our federal government needs to step in and be much more vigorous in helping our 50 states cope with the pandemic. We're also suffering, as are all other countries, from a severe recession. It's hit the United States economy hard. There is a very high level of unemployment, of business failure. That situation could get worse before it gets better over the next few months. And there's a third crisis here inside the United States in addition to the pandemic and the recession, and that's the crisis of race. And if you've been obviously watching what's been happening in the United States over the last 3 or 4 months, you've seen a series of brutal murders of African Americans, sometimes by police officers. You've seen mass demonstrations, most of them peaceful demonstrations, where African Americans and white Americans and Americans of all colors and creeds have come together to argue for racial justice. If you put those three crises together, the pandemic, the recession, and the race crisis, I think our national leadership, our new President Joe Biden, our congressional leadership in both Republican and Democratic parties, they're going to have to focus first at home. But of course, the United States is a global power. We cannot succeed in the world if we're not active in the world. And I think the first thing that I would anticipate is that the United States under the Biden administration is going to rejoin the world and rejoin the global leadership table. President-elect Biden has said very consistently, publicly on the campaign trail, and he's repeated this during the transition that is underway, that the United States is going to rejoin the Paris climate change agreements, that we know that we have to do our bit to help the world combat the worst aspects of climate change and environmental damage. You'll see the United States back in the climate change talks. You'll also see the United States return to the World Health Organization, and President-elect Biden has made that a priority and said that will happen very quickly after he takes office. In the middle of a pandemic, where every country in the world is experiencing terrible problems, it is absolutely essential that the United States return and work with South Korea and China and Russia and the Europeans and Japan and countries all over the world to try to curb the pandemic, to try to have greater support for the World Health Organization. And we hope that that organization can reform itself, because it has not been perfect, certainly not in the way it treated China at the beginning of the crisis, but I think you'll see a much more active United States in the World Health Organization. And in general, I think the United States, which under President Trump has either isolated itself from the world in many respects, or has acted unilaterally in the world, I think there's a consensus certainly in our country now, the majority of people, that the United States needs to be a good citizen of the world and become active again in all of the alliances and organizations that are important for global stability, economic stability, political stability. So that's the second point of emphasis after the tending to problems at home. It's a return of the United States to global leadership, and that's felt acutely here by people in the United States. Obviously, as we think about the U.S. returning to global leadership, there's no question in my mind that there'll be a heavy emphasis on Europe because the European Union remains the largest trade partner of the United States. The European Union is the largest investor in the American economy, and NATO in the transatlantic region it represents the largest collection of American military allies in the world. I served at NATO as U.S. ambassador on 9/11 and at the beginning of the Iraq and Afghan wars, so I feel this profoundly, that Europe and NATO and returning to leadership in NATO and improving our relationship with Germany and France and the United Kingdom and other countries of Western Europe is really going to be a first-order priority for the United States. But having said that, there's no question in my mind, and I teach this here at the Harvard Kennedy School, that the Indo-Pacific, your part of the world, is going to become the most important part of the world for the world economy, for global stability, for global peace, and certainly as the United States looks at the world, the Indo-Pacific will, in the next decade, and the decade beyond that, and then up to 2050, it will be the most important part of the world. Because obviously if you look at global trade patterns and transport of oil and gas, it's the most important region in the world for the energy-producing countries of the Middle East to transport their oil and gas westward across the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal through the Strait of Malacca to the big Asian economies like South Korea. If we think about container traffic, it's the most heavily trafficked route in the world for surface container ships that carry a lot of the world's exports and imports. In addition to that, if you think about power, military power, well, many of the strongest military powers in the world are on that map of the Indo-Pacific: the United States, Japan, the Republic of Korea, your country, China, and India. And so it's really going to be the locus of military power in the world. And if we think of economic power, in addition to the European Union economy, the largest economies in the world are all on the map of the Indo-Pacific: the United States, China, Japan, India, and the Republic of Korea. And so I think many people now agree around the world that it's the Indo-Pacific from an economic standpoint, from an energy standpoint, from a container traffic standpoint, from a military standpoint, which is going to be the part of the world that is most important for global stability. We feel this acutely in the United States because, of course, we are an Atlantic country. I'm speaking to you today from Massachusetts, close by the Atlantic Ocean. So we face, on the Atlantic, we face east towards Europe, but we also face west. We're a Pacific country, as all of you know. Our largest state, our most powerful state, California, the engine of the American economy, is a Pacific Rim state. Washington and Oregon are Pacific Rim states. Alaska and Hawaii are in the Pacific. And so increasingly, as Americans think about our global strategy, we know we have to be involved in the Atlantic and in Europe, but we know that we have to step up and increase our involvement in the Indo-Pacific region. And I know that you know all this in South Korea, but I thought I should repeat it to this particular audience because I think it is going to be a major, major priority for the next administration and the administration after that. In addition to focusing on the Indo-Pacific, there's no question in my mind that the United States is going to have a new focus on our alliances. I talked about our alliances in the Atlantic world with Canada and the European countries in NATO, but we have priority military alliances, political strategic alliances in the Indo-Pacific. Our alliance with South Korea is one of the most important alliances we have in the world. The commitment that the United States has to the security and defense of South Korea from North Korea and from others is rock solid. I think the American public understands how important this is, members of Congress understand, and certainly I think the new administration will take very seriously the alliance responsibilities that we have with South Korea. And that means a maintenance of the American troop presence. I hope, personally, that we'll see a maintenance of the American troop presence on the Korean Peninsula, in South Korea itself. It means a very close strategic relationship between the governments in Seoul and the governments in Washington, D.C. It means that our two governments need to be strategically aligned. We need to be tactically aligned. We have to have constant communications between us to make sure that the alliance is solid and that there is effective deterrence against North Korea. That return to alliance is going to be very, very important for the United States. I know as a private citizen, as a college professor at Harvard University, that the relationship between South Korea and the United States has been rocky. It's been troubled. It's been unnecessarily, I think, tense over the last few years. I certainly believe as one citizen that we need to make every effort to shore up our alliance with South Korea, politically and militarily and economically. And I hope very much that's what the new administration and the Congress in both parties will do, because we know how important South Korea is to the future of your region, but also so important to the future of the United States. And of course, we also have to think about the North Korean problem and the North Korean nuclear problem. I actually felt that when President Trump in 2018 decided that he should negotiate personally with Kim Jong-un, I know there was criticism of President Trump for doing that. I actually felt it was the right decision, given the nature of the regime in Pyongyang, given the authoritarian nature of the government. There's only really one person whose views matters, and that's Kim Jong-un. And because the United States had never had a significant conversation with him until President Trump and Secretary Mike Pompeo met him several times, it made sense to test the proposition about whether or not we and South Korea could work effectively with Kim Jong-un. I think we all know what the result is. Kim Jong-un was not serious about those negotiations. He was not forthcoming on the issues that mattered to South Korea, to Japan, to the United States, to the United Nations, and the negotiations were a disappointment. But I do think President Trump was right to try. But now President Trump's administration, I think, has run out of ideas for how to handle Kim Jong-un. And it's my own personal view, and I worked in the Bush administration. In the second term of President George W. Bush, I was Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and as you remember, our Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, and President Bush tried very hard through the six-party talks to try to convince the North Koreans to stand down on their nuclear weapons programs and to denuclearize. That negotiation failed. I was also a member of the Clinton administration. I was not working on the agreed framework of 1994. I was an advisor to President Clinton on Russia and Ukraine affairs, but I remember well that attempt in 1994 and 1995 with the agreed framework to try to have another agreement with the North Koreans. And so what does that tell us today? I think we do have to try diplomacy with North Korea. We have to see, it's my personal view, if the North Korean regime is interested and capable of undertaking productive negotiations over the nuclear issue. But what I would recommend personally, as a diplomat, as someone who teaches diplomacy and negotiations, is that if we begin anew with negotiations or with some kind of diplomatic initiative to think through how to denuclearize North Korea, there has to be very, very tight strategic understanding between the United States and the Republic of Korea, the government in Seoul, your government. And if I'm critical of President Trump on this issue, I don't think that he involved South Korea directly enough. I don't think he should have had one-on-one meetings with Kim Jong-un without President Moon Jae-in in the room. I think the United States and South Korea need to be very tightly together and seen by the North Koreans to be together strategically and tactically, so that any attempt by Pyongyang to separate the United States and South Korea would not succeed. That was the theory in the six-party talks during the George W. Bush administration, that the United States would be very, very integrated in its strategy with both South Korea and Japan. And that we would, of course, try to involve China in this effort, as well as Russia, because those countries have influence in North Korea. But I think where we should begin, what I would advise, is we begin between Seoul and Washington. And we begin with an understanding between our two countries, we're all allies, that we're not going to allow ourselves to be separated in these talks, that any meetings that the United States has will be fully transparent to or with the South Korean government as we face North Korea. I would say the same thing about Japan. It's not as close to the problem as South Korea is, but it's very important for the Japanese to be involved in these talks. I think it helps South Korea and the United States to have Japan involved. And I think the most difficult part of this will be to try to convince the Chinese government that it needs to use its influence, its economic and political influence on North Korea to push for change in the behavior of Kim Jong-un and the North Korean regime. We cannot accept a nuclear weapons force, in my personal opinion, on the Korean Peninsula. We should not agree in any way, shape, or form to a future that includes North Korea as a nuclear weapons power. We should do everything we can, diplomatically, politically, through sanctions if that's necessary, in a negotiation to convince the North Koreans to deconstruct their nuclear weapons platform. And I do think ultimately that is in the interest of China, and that is in the interest of Russia as well. So this issue of North Korea, of course, is going to be a major priority for the new administration, the new Congress in both parties. And it's an issue that I think begins with a strategic set of discussions between Seoul and Washington. That's what was missing in Donald Trump's policy, and I think it was a fatal mistake for the Trump administration to be so dismissive in some ways of the role of South Korea. From a wider perspective, it's going to be very, very important for the United States to be reconfirming its commitment to South Korea, its military and treaty commitments, and reconfirming our military commitments to our ally Japan, and reconfirming our military commitments to our ally Australia. The backbone of the American presence in the Indo-Pacific is with South Korea and Japan and Australia. It's also through our defense agreements with the Philippines, and that's a very difficult relationship for us that I hope in the new administration can be improved, and also with Thailand, a troubled country right now. And there's another country in the region who I think can be very helpful to South Korea, as well as the United States, and that's India. India is not going to be a formal treaty ally of the United States or of Japan or South Korea, but it's a very important strategic, political, and military partner. India, I expect, will stay non-aligned. That's been the Indian tradition since the birth of modern India in 1947. But we've seen the Indians change quite dramatically over the last 15 years or so, until the beginning of this century, the 21st century. As you remember, most of India's military technology came from the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation that succeeded it. But in the last 10 to 15 years, most of India's most important technology in the military sphere has come from the United States, come from Israel, come from some of the European countries. And the Indians, of course, have a major problem with China. We saw that this past summer in the conflict along the long border in the Himalayas between India and China. India very, very desirous to, of course, protect its territorial integrity. And we've seen it in the development of the Quad, which is a very important development in the Indo-Pacific, where the United States and Japan and Australia and India have come together in common cause. You saw in Tokyo just 6 weeks ago a meeting of the foreign ministers, including the United States Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, which I thought was a very positive meeting. My hope is that the Quad will deepen its cooperation in the military and political and maybe even in the economic realm, and that the Quad should begin to include other countries that are like-minded, and certainly the first country that one would think of would be South Korea. So I think this emphasis that the United States will reemerge, will embrace its alliances in the Indo-Pacific with South Korea, Japan, Australia, and others, to continue to build the Quad countries and extend some of those activities in naval exercises, air exercises to countries like South Korea. I think that makes sense for the United States. That's what I believe personally, and I think you'll see the United States be much more involved in the Indo-Pacific, including with the ASEAN countries at the ASEAN Regional Forum, and including certainly looking at the problems of the South China Sea and the East China Sea. I actually teach classes here at Harvard on the politics and the law of the South China Sea crisis and the East China Sea crisis. There's no question that China is violating international law in what it's doing in the South China Sea, in the Spratly and Paracel Islands. It has contested the sovereignty of the 5 other claimants to the Spratly and Paracels. It is making China extravagant legal claims to territory that it simply does not own under the Law of Sea Conference of 1972, using the 9-dash line, which actually came from the Kuomintang, from the Chiang Kai-shek government in 1947. The People's Republic now is claiming territory that is not theirs. I think there needs to be, obviously, a major effort by the countries of Asia, as well as countries like the United States, Pacific Rim countries, to continue to demonstrate to the Chinese that we will not accept their legal claims, that cases like the one that the Philippines brought at the International Court of Justice in 2016, that those cases have a lot of merit, that the ASEAN countries need support, they need political support. I hope that the United States, and I expect the United States, will continue its freedom of navigation exercises in international waters that China may claim, to demonstrate to the Chinese government and to the People's Liberation Army that the South China Sea is not the possession of China, that these are international waters largely, and that surface vessels, commercial vessels, military naval vessels, and in the airspace, both civilian and military aircraft have the right of transit and have the freedom to navigate through the South China Sea, both maritime and airspace. It's very, very important that all of us continue to assert those rights, because China is clearly pushing out and testing the resolve of the international community. The East China Sea, of course, as you all know very, very well, is a different type of conflict. There in the Senkaku Islands, the Diaoyu Islands as the Chinese call them, the United States has asserted that the US-Japan Defense Treaty covers the Senkaku Islands. I think that's a very direct message to the Chinese government that any attempt by China, which I do not expect to happen, but any hypothetical Chinese attempt to infringe upon, by military means, the sovereignty of Japan, of course, comes under the US-Japan Defense Treaty. That's a deterrent that I think the Chinese understand. And therefore, I do not expect any Chinese attempt to interfere with Japan in a military basis on the East China Sea, but still you have to continue, our country has to continue to assert our defense of Japan, and also the rights that the Japanese have as the administrators of the Senkaku Islands. And last, I'd just say that, as you all know very well, Taiwan has become a particular issue. People all around the world concerned that the Chinese government, the PLA, might, in the next years or decade, attempt to subjugate the people of Taiwan through military force. This would be a great mistake. This would be a historic mistake by the Chinese government if it tried to do so. Taiwan has the right to live as a free democracy. It has a right to its own system of government. And Taiwan, as we've seen from the recent elections in Taiwan at the beginning of 2020, is a vibrant democracy, an active democracy. Taiwan is a very impressive economy. It's a world leader in many of the advanced technologies that are so important to the global economy. And I think it's increasingly very important for countries around the world to make clear to the Chinese government that the independence of Taiwan is extremely important to the rest of the world, that any attempt by the Chinese to subjugate the people of Taiwan would be met with mass political and economic opposition. And of course, for the United States, this is a very complex issue. We recognize one China, the People's Republic of China, but when we made that decision back in 1972, Congress also passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which gives the United States the right and indeed the obligation to help the people of Taiwan to defend themselves. And so you've seen over the years arms transfers by the United States to Taiwan. I think there's a great deal of sentiment in both of our political parties here in the United States that we should continue to sell and provide defensive technology to the people of Taiwan. So the Indo-Pacific, if we think about North Korea's nuclear problem, tensions on the Korean Peninsula, the alliances that the United States has with South Korea, Japan, Australia, our partnership with India, the complications of the South and East China Sea, and the complications of Taiwan, I think there's no more important region in the world right now, and none more vital for global stability than your part of the world. And that brings me to the relationship that all of us have with China. And I'll just speak about the relationship that the United States has with China. I said before that I thought that the Indo-Pacific was the most important region of the world for the United States. There's no question that the most important and also the most complicated relationship that the United States has in the world is with the People's Republic of China. We are the two world's leading economies. We're the two strongest military powers. I would say that the United States and China are the most advanced technology societies of the world in terms of artificial intelligence and quantum computing and biotechnology, the digital era technologies that are going to be so important. And for most of the last 41 years, we've had full diplomatic relations for 41 years. The United States and China, until very recently, had been largely engaging each other while also competing in certain realms. But we were engaging each other through the thousands of joint ventures that our companies, or tens of thousands that our joint ventures that our companies have together. We were engaging ourselves through the fact that there are 375,000 Chinese students at American universities, including at my university, Harvard, and that the interplay of China and the United States diplomatically, economically, politically around the world was one largely of cooperation, but that has all changed. That era of US-China engagement, I think, is coming to an end in some ways. We're still going to trade with Japan. We'll still have students in each other's countries. We'll still have joint ventures. But the real, the emphasis in the relationship has changed from cooperation to competition. And there's no question that both in both of our parties, the Republican Party here and the Democratic Party, there is strong support that we need to compete with China. And we're competing in four principal areas. First, we're competing militarily for strategic predominance in the Indo-Pacific, the United States having been the strongest military power since the close in Asia, since the close of the Second World War. China is certainly contesting America's military predominance by the development of China's Blue Water Navy, by the development of its sophisticated ballistic missiles, by its aggressive behavior towards the Philippines and Vietnam in the Spratly and Paracel Islands, its aggressive behavior towards Japan in the East China Sea and the Senkaku Islands. China contesting the American carrier task forces that have been the backbone of the naval presence of the United States for the last 75 years since the end of the Second World War. All this is alarming to Americans, and I think there's a determination. I know there's a determination in the United States that we want to strengthen our military position. We don't want to see it weakened, and that gets back to the alliances that we talked about, particularly with your country, with South Korea and Japan. And so I think this first confrontation, this competition militarily, is a very important one. A lot of it has to do with the next generation technology, military technology that's being developed in the digital age as we see artificial intelligence militarized, or quantum computing used for military purposes, or biotechnology used for military purposes. This is a fierce competition between the two countries, or I should say between China on the one hand and America and its allies on the other. And this technological competition for military power is going to be very, very important. There's a second competition that you all are very familiar with, and that is China's refusal to trade fairly with the rest of the world. It's China's refusal to honor its commitments under the World Trade Organization on patents, on intellectual property rights. I hope personally that the United States will now respond to this challenge by working more closely with Japan and South Korea, and even the European Union, because together we're all free democratic societies. We are market economies. If we band together in the World Trade Organization and we insist that China play by the rules and adhere to the rule of law and stop the illegal theft of intellectual property, for example, that would be a very powerful combination. That's more than 60% of global GDP, South Korea, Japan, the United States, the European Union. President Trump's mistake, his great mistake among many that he made as president, was to pick fights, trade fights with South Korea, trade fights and tariff wars with Japan and the European Union and Canada, and he alienated our allies when he should have been uniting our allies, because we all have a variation of the same problem, and that's China's mercantilistic economic policies and the Chinese state's refusal to adhere to the rule of law in the WTO. So this second competition, which is all about economic rights and free trade and rules of the road, that's very important for your economy in South Korea. It's important for the economy of the United States. We ought to be doing more together. And the third area of competition, as I said, is in technology. China wants to be the global technology leader in artificial intelligence by 2025. China's using the enormous resources of the state, of the government of China, to give advantage to its own companies in competition with foreign companies. And I think all of us, and I think of the technology leaders in the world, South Korea is right there as one of the world's technology leaders, as is the United States. We need to be working together to make sure that we are developing the 21st century technologies that will power the global economy. And finally, I would say, in terms of the China-US competition, and I think South Korea is involved in this too, it's a battle over values. Xi Jinping is the first Chinese leader after Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao to essentially assert very publicly and very aggressively that the authoritarian state system that China represents is a model for the rest of the world. He said that a few weeks ago at the end of the extraordinary political meetings in Beijing that led to really making Xi Jinping president for life, an end to the 10-year terms that the General Secretary of the Communist Party and the President of China held under Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao. And his assertion that the authoritarian way of life and authoritarian governments is a superior model, of course, is not something that we believe. It's not what South Koreans believe. It's not what the Japanese believe. It's not what the United States believes. It's not what India believes. It's not what Europe believes. And we should have the self-confidence to be making sure that we're contending in this global argument, that we're present, that we're making the argument for democracy, the rule of law, market economies, fair trade. That's a very important public debate for us to be involved in. The final thing I want to say about the US-China relationship is that I think the most difficult part of it for both the Chinese government and the United States is there any balance between this highly competitive phase that we clearly are in and some elements of cooperation? Because I certainly do not believe that we're going to see a decoupling of the global economy where China and the United States cease to trade. I don't think we'll see that. Or China and the United States separate the world, in effect, into two blocks. I think the global economy is too complicated. It's too highly integrated for anyone to think realistically that decoupling is even possible, much less desirable. But I do think it's important that as we compete, and I certainly support this tougher, competitive American viewpoint towards China on the military issues and the economic issues and the issue of democratic values that I've talked about, at the same time, we have to cooperate with China on some issues. Certainly, we ought to be cooperating on the pandemic. I would hope that the United States and China could be working together, and they really should be working together with South Korea, because your country your government has one of the finest records in the world in its response to the pandemic. We ought to be working with Japan and the European Union and Brazil and Nigeria. So I think that's where the US and China can work together on the pandemic. We certainly can work together on climate change. You'll remember that it was President Barack Obama and Vice President Joe Biden working with President Xi Jinping. That was a big part of the movement towards the Paris Climate Change Agreement in 2015. And I would hope we could work together with the Chinese on that. And finally, there are other issues where we can work with China, stabilizing the global economy during this very serious global recession. That means the G20 should be working together. South Korea, Japan, China, India, the United States, Brazil, the EU, Russia, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. We've all got to be in this together in aligning our fiscal and monetary policies so that the world economy can make a rebound. Hopefully after the vaccines have been distributed, hopefully when the pandemic comes to an end, we can refloat the global economy, return to manufacturing, return to prosperity, and in both of our countries, working with China is essential. So I think there has to be a balance between the highly competitive nature of our relationship with South Korea and cooperation. I think you have to probably give more of the balance to competition, but we Americans have to be careful and make sure that we're talking to the government of China and are cooperating in those limited spheres, but they're important, that I talked about. So there's so much that I think we could say. I wish I was there in person. I wish I could meet you all and we could have extended conversations about this. I do want to say, as a way of summarizing, there's no question in my mind that we Americans need to return faithfully and energetically to global leadership. No question in my mind that we will do that, certainly under Joe Biden's leadership, and I think this is going to be supported by many members of Congress. The United States has to return to global leadership, to involvement in the world, and the first place we have to do that is with our allies, our treaty allies. These are the most important countries in the world to the United States, to our future, and I would begin with South Korea and just reaffirming that South Korea is a valued ally, the continuation of our military relationship, our economic and trade relationship, our political partnership is going to be very important for the United States going forward. I wish you all well for a successful conference. I thank you for inviting me to give these personal views. I'm here not as a representative. I cannot represent the new administration. I'm not part of the Biden transition team, but I'm someone who obviously is paying attention to global politics, and I have my background as an American Foreign Service officer, and I'm confident that better days are ahead for the United States and South Korea and for the world with this new administration coming into office in the United States of America. Thank you for listening to me today. I appreciate it very much. I'd be very happy to be in contact with you by email or perhaps in a future video session so that we can have a conversation about all these issues. Thank you so much for listening to me today.